and I'm the current director of the Aquinas Center. And we want to welcome you to our panel on what's next. And I've asked Andy Otto, who has been working on this at least since August, September, who is the adult faith formation. He's a pastoral associate at Thomas More for faith formation, and he is going to be facilitating our evening. And so I'm just going to turn it over to Andy, and he can introduce the panel and tell you what we're going to be doing.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and good evening to everyone joining on the webinar. Before we begin with any sort of logistics, let's open in just some prayer and remind ourselves who it is who brought us here. So let's just pause in a moment of silence and recognize the presence of God. Loving God, giver of life, enliven our hearts with your spirit of justice. Enliven our actions to be oriented toward your way of dignity giving, of life, of generosity, of gratitude. We come together as people who are hurting, who are grieving, yet who retain hope. Bless our conversation this evening. Amen. So the way it's going to work this evening is our panelists will offer a few minutes of some points from their areas of expertise. And this is going to be primarily a dialogue. So after their short presentations, we're going to turn to one another and just have some conversation about what is stirring for us. And then after that, we'll have large group conversation, and rather than being a Q&A for the panel, it's going to be some questions and some comments just amongst us as a community. Okay? And the panelists can certainly respond. So allow me to introduce our panelists this evening. Susan Reynolds is Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at Emory University, Candler School of Theology, a theologian and scholar of U.S. Catholicism. Her research examines lived Catholicism in context of diversity, marginality, and suffering. Susan's work has been published in journals, edited volumes, and popular outlets, and she is a frequent contributor to conversations on Catholicism and public life. Next is William Cossen. He is a historian of the 19th and 20th century United States, specializing in religion and nationalism. He has a PhD in history from Penn State University and is a member of the faculty of the Gwinnett School of Mathematics, Science, and Technology. His current book project is titled Making Catholic America, Religious Nationalism in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Next is Andy Lichtenwalner. He is the director of the Office of Formation and Discipleship in the Archdiocese of Atlanta. He earned his MA in theology from the University of Dallas and a PhD in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America. He worked for 12 years for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, serving as executive director of the Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth for 6 of those years. Marie Breitenbeck is a member of the Dominican Sisters of Adrian, Michigan. She holds advanced degrees in psychology, theology, and a doctorate in canon law. She's been an active member of the Canon Law Society of America since 1975. Marie currently serves as canonical consultant to bishops, clergy, laity, and religious, as well as hearing officer in the Canon Law Society of America's Committee on Professional Responsibility. And Desmond Drummer is the pastor at Most Blessed Sacrament Church in South Fulton and the chaplain at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic High School in Fayetteville. He is also involved with the Interfaith Chaplaincy Program at the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Desmond is a graduate of Morehouse College and Mundelein Seminary. We welcome all 5 of you this evening. And we'll begin with Susan.
Wonderful. Is this on? Okay, good. Thank you so much to Mary, to Andy for the invitation to be with you all this evening. We've each been asked to keep our remarks to around 5 to 7 minutes so as to facilitate maximum time for conversation amongst all of us. So I am hoping to honor that. I'm often asked, as probably many of you are, from friends or perhaps non-Catholic friends, others, what caused the sexual abuse crisis? What's at the heart of it? People want to know. What does it all come down to? This is, of course, on some level, an impossible question to answer. If these were singular, isolated incidents, their direct causes might be more easy to discern, but the systemic, protracted nature of both the abuse and the cover-ups make any attempt at simple answers much more obviously inadequate. The causes of the sexual abuse crisis are multitudinous and complex, as those who have carefully studied the issue have tried to demonstrate. Yet there are certain clarities, of which I'll focus on one. It's impossible to respond to the question of what's next, the title of tonight's panel, without attending to the social sin of clericalism. And we hear quite a bit about this notion of clericalism, so it's helpful to define our terms in some way because it's used in many different ways by many different people. What is clericalism? Clericalism, quite simply, is a form of idolatry. It's a distorted vision of the relationship of power among lay and ordained persons, in which those who are ordained are regarded and come in some ways to regard themselves, often subconsciously, as above and apart, right? Holier, purer, ontologically superior, closer to God, indeed somehow godlike themselves. The result is a relationship of domination that leads to abuse in many forms, both obvious and insidious. It's the unshakable conviction that Father knows best, quote unquote, right? A level of unquestioning trust that makes painfully evident why in many cases the testimonies of abuse victims were questioned, dismissed, and buried even sometimes by their own families. It's manifested in a perception of the priest as superhero, right? Set apart, mysterious, ontologically different from those whom he serves. This image of priest as superhero, in fact, risks a distortion of the priestly vocation as described in the Second Vatican Council's decree on the ministry and life of priests, which states that they are not, quote, to be separated from the people of God or from any person. In this way, clericalism wounds not only lay people, but also those who are ordained. For clergy, it leads to loneliness and isolation. It robs them of the possibility of deep, life-giving relationships with lay people in the church and, honestly, with other priests. And in ways that mirror, in some ways, what's come to be known in broader social discourse as toxic masculinity. It warps their own humanity and self-understanding, sometimes to tragic ends. Critically, a culture of clericalism in the church has contributed to what German moral theologian Katharina Westerhorstmann has called ecclesiolatry, which she defines as, quote, an exaggerated focus on the church that leads people to suppress any kind of critique or allegation against members of the clergy and against the church itself. She notes that often the abused are harmed again by being treated as if they were the victimizers of the church, insofar as they've told the truth, insofar as they've shared their story. Ultimately, clericalism is a social sin made manifest in the daily particularities and structural realities of clerical culture, of ecclesial culture. It implicates all of us, lay and ordained alike, and tears at the fabric of the ecclesial community. Only when we come to regard holiness, not as super heroic individual greatness, but rather as a fundamentally relational category, a function of one's embeddedness in the shared life of the community, can we begin to imagine a more just and indeed more Christian way of practicing ministry and being church. So, in the words of the title of this evening's panel, what's next? As is often the case in Catholicism, and was the case, for example, at the Second Vatican Council, renewal in this historical moment might take the form of ressourcement, a discerning, creative, spirit-led recovery of the sources of our faith and of the church. This is not, it should be noted, a nostalgic return to some mythical and imagined golden age of U.S. Catholicism. Rather, it's a return to the authentic roots of our tradition. This, I would briefly suggest, can happen in two ways. It can certainly happen in many ways, but I'll mention two. First, through a re-emphasis on lay leadership. The history of U.S. Catholicism makes an interesting teacher in this respect. Until the 19th century, the mid to late 19th century, Catholics were a profound minority in the colonies and then subsequently in the United States. Because there was no seminary infrastructure yet established in this so-called New World, Catholics here relied on priests who immigrated with them or who were brought over from Europe, but mostly they relied on lay people, including communities of women religious. So the spirit of lay leadership is in many ways fundamental to American Catholicism. It's in our bones. A deeper understanding of this tradition would, I believe, serve U.S. Catholics well at this critical juncture. Second, I would argue for a second and even more comprehensive return, and that's a return to holiness. But what do I mean by that? It seems to me that in this moment, lay people are utilizing lament and even anger to call the church to holiness, not a holiness of ethereal perfection or individualistic heroism, but of deep community. In her book, Friends of Gods and Prophets, theologian Elizabeth Johnson reminds us that holiness is a fundamentally relational category. Johnson assiduously identifies the consequences of patriarchally conditioned understandings of Christian sanctity, in which holiness is regarded as a kind of reward for individual piety. The holy person, the holy priest, the holy church, we mistakenly feel is one that's set apart from everybody else, isolated, invulnerable, impermeable, almost inhuman. Yet this is not the understanding of holiness that we find in Scripture. In the Jewish tradition, Johnson notes, holiness is not primarily a descriptor of the moral quality of an individual life, but rather reflects a consecration of the people's very being. Similarly, a Christian notion of social sanctity, of social holiness, relational holiness, reflects a belief that the gift of the Holy Spirit is poured out in equal measure on the entire community of the baptized. So in other words, it's almost erroneous to speak only of holy persons, right? A person's holiness is a factor of his or her embeddedness in the life and the fabric of the community, of the people of God. A holy church is a humble church, a penitent church, a church of deep relationships and honesty. So our best hope in this moment, I think, is that this crisis might become a kind of kairos for the church in the U.S. and around the world, a moment of truth that, like a fire, continues to refine this palpable sense of anger and betrayal that many of you, I know, have voiced into a kind of resolve. It would be a tragic missed opportunity for those in positions of authority in the church not to recognize and empower this wave of lay energy. People don't want finessed press releases. We know this. They don't want public relations campaigns. I lived in Boston for a number of years in the wake of the crisis there, and I can tell you that people don't want those things. Those have done nothing for the church there. They don't want prepared answers to hard questions. They want repentance, right? They want accountability. They want humility. And then they want to be empowered to lead in the work of calling the church to holiness.
Thank you. Already messing this up. There we go. So I'm an historian by training, so I won't really offer much in the way of prescriptive solutions because then that would, I think, engage in too much future seeking, and that's what I'm very ill-equipped to do by discipline. So this will be a past-looking paper. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room today who has had the subject of clerical sex abuse on their mind since this past August, when the Pennsylvania grand jury report on the subject was issued. In response to that report, immediately, I wrote an article for the Washington Post on democratization and lay reform as necessary responses to institutional corruption in the church. Then, at the end of the month, Christine Kennelly published a disturbing piece of investigatory journalism about profound abuse of children by nuns in Catholic orphanages, which shook me as a scholar of American Catholicism quite severely, since that was an early bit of research of mine was American convents. It left me with a lingering question. Are historians of Catholicism going to be viewed a century from now as aiders and abettors of historical sex abuse, as suppressors, however unconsciously, of an accurate telling of the past for the sake of promoting an inaccurate, idealized image of the Catholic Church? I'm still not entirely sure what to make of all of this, and how scholars should begin to integrate this material into their research. One of my colleagues asked me rhetorically whether abuse happened because of something unique to Catholicism and whether it only happened in Catholic spaces. There are horrendous crimes and cover-ups involved, she noted, but asking the right questions of them is part of moving forward. So I hope that we can begin asking some of those questions today, and then I can provide some historical context and critical perspective on the current crisis. So I'll begin by asking two such questions right now. First, why is this crisis such an appalling one? And why are we now so shaken by the news that came out of Pennsylvania last year, when we know simultaneously that none of this is particularly new or different when compared to previous such crises in either scope or substance? Sex, sexuality, and sex abuse have been central concerns on the part of the Church for centuries. Since the 1960s, the Catholic Church has undergone massive transformations. As historian Mark Massa explains, Vatican II wrought a revolution in the minds of both lay and clerical Catholics. It allowed them to see their church as a historical human institution. This idea of what he calls historical consciousness, which suggested to members of the church that its doctrines were indeed subject to change, had the unintended consequence of allowing Catholics to question their loyalty to an institution that may not have been as changeless as once thought. In this respect, then, the Church and its teachings were not very different from other previously unexamined social teachings and practices whose foundations became subject to reconsideration, attack, and dismissal in what historians Maurice Isserman and Michael Kazin call the Global 60s. Although the Church's current clergy sexual abuse scandal is a relatively recent one, a large body of scholarly literature has for the past 2 decades attempted to make sense of a crisis that is seemingly global in scale and whose roots reach back not just decades, but perhaps even centuries. It's clear that a number of priests and bishops throughout the Catholic world have deviated from the moral and disciplinary course prescribed by the Vatican. Sociologists of religion Rodney Stark and Roger Finke have argued that Vatican II, which aimed to renew the Catholic Church and to bring it up to date, ironically brought about a precipitous decline in religious vocations around the world. The Council approved the modernization of several religious orders and blurred many of the distinctions that previously separated clergy and laity. Where vocations once bestowed a high level of prestige and rewards on members of the clergy, the post-conciliar church removed many of the benefits by expanding leadership roles to lay people and by declaring the church to be the people of God. However, the high costs of becoming a priest or a religious brother or sister, including celibacy, lower income, and lack of mobility, remained. Individuals aspiring to a religious vocation had less incentive to pursue one with such high costs and such low benefits. Stark and Finke proposed 2 possible remedies. First, the church could restore some of the benefits of pursuing a vocation, for instance, sharpening the lines between clergy and laity. And second, the church could lower the costs of religious life, namely eliminating celibacy. Would this eliminate sex abuse from the clergy? I'm not convinced it would. Evidence of any sort of connection between celibacy and child sex abuse is unpersuasive. This post-conciliar period, though, is one upon which we should focus our attention. Religion scholar Peter Steinfels has recently written for Commonweal a detailed corrective of many of the unexamined assumptions of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which have been frequently accepted uncritically by media, prosecutors, and the public. A strong critique from Steinfels is that the vast majority of abuse allegations, whether substantiated or unsubstantiated, came from the 2 decades immediately following Vatican II. And there's been a dramatic decline in cases of abuse and allegations made after the 2002 Archdiocese of Boston scandal, which drew much of the public's attention to sex abuse in the Catholic Church, and after which the USCCB adopted its Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, also known as the Dallas Charter. Steinfels points out that the Dallas Charter's protocols have been effective. After 2002, priests facing credible allegations of abuse were immediately removed from ministry, were sometimes defrocked, and were reported to civil authorities. In a large number of the accounts of abuse discussed in the grand jury report, offending priests had already been removed from ministry or defrocked years earlier, and in many cases were long deceased. In the wake of public outrage over the Pennsylvania report, Steinfels writes, and I'm going to quote at length here because I think it's important, "I wondered whether Catholics and others had forgotten that flood of painful 2002 revelations, to say nothing of the primetime exposés of the early 1990s. What about the 2004 and 2011 studies by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, concluding that 4,392 priests, between 4 and 5% of the Catholic clergy, have been responsible for more than 11,000 cases of sexual abuse between 1950 and 2002? Had no one really taken to heart these earlier disclosures? What precisely, I asked myself, did the Pennsylvania report tell us that was new? Did it refute the crucial and widespread belief that the Dallas Charter had changed things dramatically? I think these are important questions demanding further discussion. Now, while the Church has been concerned with rooting out sexual deviancy from its ranks for centuries, its definition of what constitutes a deviant act has changed over time. As has been pointed out repeatedly by scholars, the celibate priesthood has long had a contested history. It has not been only since the 1960s that the question of whether or not Catholic priests should be allowed to marry has been a salient one. Although the church hierarchy may have been aware of priest sexual activity for many years, in some respects, the general public only discovered sex among priests in the period following Vatican II. There is a case to be made that the media has been at least partly to blame for the sensationalism surrounding abuse scandals and for often inflating the number of abusive priests. Furthermore, this media treatment cannot be separated from the long history of American anti-Catholicism, which propagated in the 19th century and into the 20th century a perception of Catholics and their church as sexually deviant disruptors of the nation and as threats to American democracy and freedom and to patriarchal order. Historian Philip Jenkins is the most prominent representative of this position. I should state for the sake of full disclosure, he was my doctoral advisor. Jenkins argues that the popular media often employs terms such as pedophilia to describe sexual relations between priests and victims, even when the latter were not prepubescent and may have sometimes been adults themselves. This doesn't alter the moral reprehensibility of priests' actions, Jenkins maintains, but rather it demonstrates that the media uses language that leaves audiences with a visceral repulsion towards priests. It's an important point, especially in light of the fact that, at least in the American context, Jenkins notes, less than 2% of all serving American priests are have been with minors, about 1,000 pederasts, as he called them, in all nationwide. Clerical sexual abuse in the decades following Vatican II and institutional cover-up were a very real phenomena. However, as Jenkins points out, from a purely numerical standpoint, the rate of child abuse by Catholic priests was likely no higher than in other similar institutions, whether religious or secular. It's equally important that the Catholic Church was often its own worst enemy in dealing with these crises. Through a combination of institutionalized homophobia, strict obedience, and an embattled mentality and distrust of non-Catholic media exhibited by a number of Vatican officials, including Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the Church frequently mishandled abuse claims and perpetuated patterns of misconduct for decades. At the same time, popular media played an essential role, for better or worse, in publicizing allegations. All this, however, could not have occurred outside of the context of the enormous changes wrought in the Church by Vatican II. The Council gave lay Catholics the ability to view their Church through, as again Massa put it, historical consciousness, which may have had the consequence of allowing them to cast a critical eye on the actions and pronouncements of Church officials, whereas before, in an era of clericalism, this may have been literally unthinkable. Even if the number of abuse allegations has been reduced significantly since the institution of the Dallas Charter, any abuse is, of course, horrific and unacceptable. At the same time, it's important, despite the difficulty, to maintain a critical, objective perspective on admittedly troubling subject matter, and it's equally necessary to pay careful attention to chronology and historical context when evaluating such a complex network of people and events. This ongoing scandal should also prompt us to engage in needed and sometimes long overdue conversations about several related issues, namely the clerical-lay relationship, the distribution of power within the Catholic Church, the role of the Church and its perception in American society, patriarchy and gender roles in the wider Church and in local parish communities, and the ways that children and marginalized Catholics exist within the Church.
Thanks, Bill and Susan. Thanks, Andy, Sister Mary, for the Aquinas Center for allowing these conversations to continue. Very important to advance transparency, accountability, the structural reform that's necessary, but most importantly, the healing and protection of young people and all who are vulnerable. So I'm grateful to be here. The scandal of clerical and episcopal sexual abuse and cover-up in the Catholic Church has been a painful reality, as we know. The extent of the depth of personal hurt, pain, and damage is untold, and we will never know the full proportions in this life. Victims and survivors who have shared their stories deserve our unfailing gratitude. The work of healing and the protection of all who are vulnerable must continue to be a priority of the Church. For those who have experienced or know of such abuse by a leader in the Church and have not reported it, we all know by now the proper authorities should be contacted immediately. Georgia has the Child Protective Services, or 911 if it's an emergency. The Archdiocese of Atlanta also has a 24-hour reporting hotline, and the information for that is available on the website. In his February meeting with presidents of Episcopal conferences, Pope Francis described the situation as follows: "It is none other than the present-day manifestation of the spirit of evil. if we fail to take account of this dimension, we will remain far from the truth and lack real solutions. In speaking of what's next, as we consider the crisis with respect to leadership in the church, it's important to keep before us the dramatic significance of the reality of evil, and in particular this evil in the church, for at least two reasons. First, human and pragmatic responses alone, even if they involve structural changes, will be insufficient to address the moral and spiritual aspects of this crisis. Second, the depth and various layers of the crisis are profound, and some have described it well as a crisis of fidelity, which has led to a crisis of credibility, which has even led to a crisis of faith. In looking to the laity and their role in the leadership of the church and in decision-making processes, I will share 2 points based on my experience in working for the church over the last several years. First, in the Catholic Church in the U.S., and I think we're well aware of this, the laity have extraordinary involvement in collaboration within leadership structures and decision-making processes. I think we're well aware of it, but I'm not sure how much the entire church, especially the church in the U.S., is aware of that, laity in the pews, to realize how involved laity are in leadership structures in the church. For example, at the national level, the day-to-day operations of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops are advanced mainly by lay men and women, who comprise most of the 300 staff people. This means the daily work of bishops' committees is carried out mainly by lay people, and the decisions and guidance that come from the conference are heavily influenced by lay expertise and experience, in a spirit of collaboration with the clergy, consecrated religious, and the bishops. One particular example of lay involvement and influence is the National Advisory Council, an appointed group of mostly lay men and women who advise the bishop's administrative committee, and that's the committee that forms the agendas for the general meetings of the bishops. The National Advisory Council reacts to action items being brought before the bishop's administrative committee, and the NAC also makes resolutions offering opinions and advice on issues it believes are pressing for the bishops to consider. This work is not just for show, as I have seen NAC decisions stall or scrap particular initiatives or documents. If not for the NAC, the Dallas Charter of 2002 would not have been as strong as it was. The National Review Board, an independent lay advisory board assisting the bishops, and especially the Bishops' Committee on the Protection of Children and Young People, is another example at the national level of important lay influence. And these are just some examples, a couple of many. We can look analogously to diocesan chanceries and parishes. The extent of lay involvement in leadership and decision-making will vary, especially at the parish level, depending on the pastor, but any healthy parish will involve a significant amount of lay leadership. My second point, care should be taken not to forget the fundamental vocation and mission of the laity, who are the church living in the world. Here in the U.S., we have been blessed with amazing lay women and men who serve in various capacities of lay ecclesial ministry. As the church continues to appreciate, support, and understand this phenomenon more fully, we also cannot neglect attention to the lay vocation as such. Leadership in the more visible institutional dimensions of the church is at the service of lay leadership and missionary discipleship in the world. It would be a mistake to see the laity, quote, coming of age by becoming more involved in parish ministries per se, or by being employed by the church. Father James Mallon, following Pope Francis, Father James Mallon is the one who wrote Divine Renovation, is doing a lot of evangelization work there. He has described this mistake as clericalism, as we've already heard about, and he connected it with the sexual abuse crisis several years before the Pope's more recent comments. In Father Mallon's words, quote, "Clericalism's association with distinct garb or the abuse of power is rather superficial. Clericalism is nothing but the appropriation of what is proper to the baptized by the clerical caste. It, quote, is ultimately a suppression of the baptismal identity, close quote. So thinking that ordinary lay people are incapable of holiness and mission leads to, and this is another quote, the isolation of the clergy and the immaturity of the baptized, according to Mallon and what Susan eloquently spoke about earlier as well. Laity who are being formed for leadership and service in the church are a great gift. And we have much to be grateful for and more work to do, especially in the areas of calling forth, recognizing, forming, authorizing, and sustaining lay leaders. However, the full context and goal of lay leadership and leadership in general need to be kept in mind. Ultimately, any renewal in leadership and decision-making processes in the church will need to attend to the recovery of the church's core mission of evangelization and the missionary and pastoral conversion Pope Francis has called for, a work that must engage the church as a whole and must recognize that lay leadership itself is broader than the institutional categories to which we sometimes resort. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Is this picking up? Thank you to the previous presenters. This has been very interesting, especially as I'm reflecting on each of the presentations in terms of the codes, plural, of canon law. And there are two codes. There's the code of canons for the Eastern churches, and there's the code of canons for the Latin Rite Church. And probably most of us belong to the Latin Rite Church. The code for the Latin Rite Church was promulgated in 1983, and the code for the Eastern Rite Church in 1990. Both codes have their groundwork and their language set in the Second Vatican Council. And as I walk through the code, it's also expected that we will have read every one of the council and post-conciliar documents. You will see walk off the pages of the codes exact language from the Second Vatican Council. And key in the code is the notion of the people of God. We are the people of God. And yes, different persons are called to utilize different gifts, but we are all the people of God. And we are all called to utilize those gifts. I take from the code something my dad used to laugh about when I would go to the end of a book and he would say, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm just checking to see if I got the right person who did it." Well, the end of the code, the 1983 code, reflects on all of the canons combined, and they're present. Here we get the call to universal holiness and the people of God. For the salvation of souls, which is always, always, I was highlighted, the supreme law of the church. And in the work of the recent synod, wherein perhaps it's not realized, but definite canonical changes were made so that non-bishops were components of that synod. And you may recall, non-bishops were also speakers to the rest of the members of that synod. It's important to understand synod, even as different in the code. The code was written in 1983. The synod, in the eyes of Pope Francis and many others, is a walking together. Has to do with collegiality, but it's a walking together. And even when the code does reference diocesan synods, it's supposed to be composed of the people of God, different representatives within the local church. So even in order to understand what transpired at this synod, one has to have that mindset of Pope Francis that we're walking together. And if you had a chance to listen to the press conference prior to the synod, you saw that language come through. Even the themes for the day, transparency, which has been addressed, accountability, responsibility, addressed over and over and over again. And that came through not only with the two main persons who were interviewed, namely Bishop Supich of Chicago, or Cardinal Supich of Chicago, and Archbishop Scicluna, when they spoke of the importance of where do we go from here, and that this is a starting point. We can't do everything at once. We're laying down the groundwork. This has to go back to the people of God in every single culture. And Archbishop Scicluna, with whom I had the opportunity of spending extensive time when he came to the United States to give a workshop on various components of the penal law process. He was talking about the fact that the bishops and the planners of the conference, including two women who also on the work in the different offices in the Vatican, that they were going to be met with resistance. And if you heard Jerry's talk on the sexual identity crisis, he said in some cultures, yes, sexual abuse occurs, but they don't even have the language for it. And now you have this group of patriarchs from the Eastern Church. You've got presidents of the bishops' conferences, and they are being told, you must go back to your countries, to your cultures. You have to get the message across. You have to come up. If you do not have programs in existence, like we have in the United States, and most countries do, in the study of the various countries that have a program, such as was based on the Dallas Charter, what was discovered is that the countries that do not have them are the countries that have very little resources, or until recently were, for lack of a better word, they called it the Iron Curtain countries. They just didn't have access to the outside world for resources to even pull together these documents. And so then there also becomes then this culture, this give and take, and that came through at the Synod also, that we help one another, we work with one another. Not that we just take, and that's why what the bishops had hoped to do in November didn't take, because there were other countries that thought, oh, we can just take what the bishops of the United States have pulled together in terms of an investigation of bishops, because that's not covered in the charter, and we can incorporate that into our country. And that's when the Pope said, it's not going to work because of the different cultures. So there's still that notion of, from all the follow-up talks to the Synod, the notion of this is a starting point. It's not going to happen overnight, but it must start. You must have programs in place, not only for the clerical abuse, but also for the reporting of abuse on occasion the bishops, because there were no vehicles, official vehicles, and even the bishops themselves raised that question and came up with all kinds of ideas to present to the Pope and to the Congregation for Bishops. And now, collectively, from this group of both bishops, patriarchs, and men and women religious, and laypersons who were part of the presenters, now they have been given, like I said, tools as well as steps. Pope Francis laid out 8 steps basically on the sexual abuse notion. However, Cardinal Cupich, in collection with Archbishop Scicluna, came up with, I believe, 12 or 14 steps, and several of those steps in terms of the reporting of abuse of bishops involve the role of the laity. And that's one area where the canon is very clear that the expertise of the laity is to be utilized. It is to be called forth. And I see this over and over and over again as I'm reading the reports that are coming from the results of the synod. And I see that most recently, Cardinal O'Malley has set up a program in his diocese for the steps in terms of reporting any allegations against the bishops. Now, granted, the allegation has to be proven, and that was a reason why many of the canon lawyers were upset with the one strike and you're out component that arose after all of the abuse arose. Because the allegation does have to be proven. And that, again, was made clear at the synod. But once proven, then the steps must be taken to address this issue on behalf of the people of God. And to go back to what Susan was saying, that whole notion of the universal call to holiness, I mean, Pope Francis just recently issued a document on the call to holiness, and it's everybody. We're all called to holiness. And so that's one of the points that they were trying to get through in terms of moving towards holiness. That much has been lost, but much can be recouped if people work in synodality. That was the whole notion. We're in this together. So that's from a canonical standpoint, collapsed version of canon law.
I have to admit that since this past summer, I was ordained in 2014. I became a pastor in 2016. And then about 2 years after becoming a pastor, we have this second wave, at least, in terms of the 2000s, with a new level of awareness, of outrage, and I did not know what was next for me personally, because my mother was in my ear, "What are you going to do?" And she all but said, I hope she doesn't see this, "If you remain a priest, you are a part of the problem." I'm hearing that. Without that, I'm already saying the same thing to myself. And I'm not the only young priest having that conversation. I have to continue meeting pastoral needs every Sunday morning, look at the people in the face and try to keep some sense of composure, even as I address it openly, putting enough of my stuff on the table without alarming people unnecessarily, because I'm not trying to add burdens to what they already know to be the situation of our church in the U.S. and around the world, but to let them know where I am without getting them to be worried about me, because that ended up happening. everybody wanted to meet for coffee, and I realized that it's not that they had some needs. They want to check on me because they thought I was going to leave. People had concerns. I still don't know what's next for me, but I'm week to week keeping it together because the people with whom I am privileged to work with and to be in relationship with remind me every day what we are called to be as a community of faith together. It is not easy to be among those who are responsible for such egregious failures. Although I am 35 years old, I do my best to take responsibility, and that does not feel good. It does not feel good, and it's I've had conversations in the narthex of my parish when I address this reality with my community and with those who visit. And for some, because I've always been seen suspiciously, both at the seminary and even after being assigned to a parish, as not really being on board with the whole Catholic thing in the first place. So when I address the real issues in our church, I'm asked, well, what do you have against our church? And I want to say, I'm wearing a vestment. I mean, you know, I don't like the vestments, but I have to wear it because then we'll have some other issues. Half this stuff I'm not really into, but I'm into the core. And they know that about me, but some folks are just suspicious enough. So then when I address it, to them, they feel like I'm getting some sort of enjoyment out of it. When I'm really trying to ensure that we do not leave it to the mainstream media to tell the story, because there are more salacious things that they're focusing on right now. So I've had to say over the pulpit and over the altar to say, look, I'm giving you this information because you're not going to find it on the front page of the New York Times. It's not on MSNBC. It's not on Fox News. It's not on CNN the way it needs to be, because they're looking at other things that are getting their audience engaged. So it is up to me and us to report to you what is happening and what is going on. So in some cases, people were getting all the bad news from their parish priest. So then, like, well, what, where why are you doing this? And then the next person in line says, thank you for addressing this in a direct manner. And I appreciate your transparency and your honesty. So I have to do it, but it's going to be read in a variety of ways. Meanwhile, I still have to work out my personal response. The McCarrick and Pennsylvania grand jury report realities emerged as I was beginning work at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic High School. So my introduction involved a discussion about this reality. And because they're on Insta, they're not getting, and because they were born after 2003, most of them were hearing it from me and looking at me like, what are you talking about? And why are you talking about it? So what happened? So I am doing my godly best to be where I need to be and to say what needs to be said and to conduct myself in a way that renders credible leadership. And yet, one of my fears is, will I let people down if I go about my life the way I would prefer to do it, even in this moment? Am I going to be letting somebody down for all the wrong reasons? I do not know what I'm going to do, but I know that when I engage in ministry in a variety of ways that manifests, I'm reminded that at least at this time, I believe it is worth it, even if it feels like it's killing me, because I do not want to be associated with any of this. And neither do many people in our church community, however they find themselves in it, with various levels of responsibility and participation. So that's my perspective from a parish priest who is within 5 years of ordination. I'm looking at the decades ahead. What more will be dredged up as we excavate these realities? When the bishops and priests of the Atlanta province, that is the dioceses of North Carolina, Charlotte and Raleigh, South Carolina, Charleston and Georgia, Savannah and Atlanta, when we had our provincial assembly in Charleston in August, it was in the middle of all of this, and they opened the floor for us to speak. And I took the mic and said, I'm 35 years old. For the time being, I plan on staying. I don't know if I will, but I don't know what the next 40 years is going to look like. And I'm not sure I have the energy and capacity to deal with that. And I'm 35 years old, so I still have options in my head. And I'm being transparent. Because it's a reality, it's a question of identity. Does my staying in priesthood, in active ministry, betray my own values? Does leaving render a prophetic statement? Or is that a failure? I'm working that out as we speak. And I appreciate you receiving my honest presentation. And I don't want you to be alarmed because, Christ is risen. The manifestation of that reality is our collective witness that is hopeful, that is purposeful, and oriented toward the good of all people. And that's pretty basic. I know there's a whole lot more to say. The theologians over on the other side of the table. But that's where I am. And I think about the leaders that have benefited my journey and all the reasons they had to leave. And I wonder if I can follow the advice that I give to everybody else. Who is counting on your commitment 20, 30 years from now? Because I've benefited from the commitment of others who I didn't even have a chance to meet because they died before I had a chance to meet them, but I was influenced by their commitment. So this is where I am. I'm praying through it. And I also lament that there are victims who are not living to see this moment that we're in because they either took their own lives or they died of old age because this has been going on for a very long time. So when I pray in the Eucharist for those who have died and I pause, it is not unusual for me to be thinking about victims who I wish could see this reckoning, this painful reckoning that we're facing. This is where we are. This is where we are. And yet we find the capacity to lean in and to ensure that this moment does not get recorded in history as just something else that happened. So I pray for all of you who are here, because I think we are all in the same boat. And I thank you for being here. And I thank you for listening to my sharing in these last few moments. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. So we've heard a little bit about the theology and history regarding the crisis, the reality of lay leadership in the church and canon law, and the experience of a priest. What's stirring for you? What's giving you hope? What's leaving you restless? I invite everyone here to turn to someone near you, have a conversation, share those things that are stirring for you, and maybe for sake of time, we'll be about 10 minutes, and then we can come back together after that to continue the conversation. So as we said, this is a dialogue, a conversation, and so the panelists are now going to be part of the larger group here. Now is a time to just share those things that have touched you in a particular way or stirred with you. So please raise your hand, and I'll come to you with the microphone. We'll go till about 6:40. Okay, just about 25 minutes, so we have enough time for as many people to speak. So comments. Certainly, and if you have a question, that's fine, yes.
Hi, my name is Francis. I'm originally from the Philippines, and I moved here in Georgia in December. Not from the Philippines, but from Chicago. Okay, I would just want to comment, Father, that I'm going to pray for you, and we will pray for you. But Father, it's actually, maybe it's a bad time to be a priest, but it's the best time to be a good priest. Because, yes, and then also for the panelists, I want to ask you if, I'm sold to the, let's say, what do you call that, destroying the, clericalism, active ministry also for the lay. But my question is that, how would you even assure that this lay would not sexually abuse? Because if one has a predisposition to abuse, sexually abuse, and would abuse, and we know that from the fact that outside the Catholic Church, there are also abuses that are going on, even in the same family. Another thing is that I think the society, especially maybe Western society, has a big part in the abuse. I would say that maybe the clericalism was the channel to perpetuate, but also to give maybe the power for the priest to sexually abuse, but also for the victims not to come out. But I think it's deeper than that. It's the society itself, because sexually abuse doesn't only happen in the church, but also, I would presume also with the nuns sexually abusing other people, I would say. So I guess it's true that, holiness, but holiness together, I love really this concept. And us here actually say, we're not going to give up. We're not going to give up. We're going to pray for the priest. In the history of the Catholic Church, we had this down about what happened in the Catholic Church, but we are the church and we're not going to give up. We're going to pray for the priest. That's it. Thank you. And the victims, yeah, of course. I know of a victim.
Hi, I'm a businessman. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I'm not going to give you an hour of background, but I think as a voter, I've got all these people speaking on my behalf. Well, the American people say this, the American people say this. As a Catholic, I look at society and I look at all of the things the scandals that have occurred in business, all of the investment scandals, all of the other things in society. All of these things are being dealt with every day. This one is nothing new. This one is nothing new. We've got a roadmap on how you deal with fraud or whatever. I've given 125 speeches about fraud in business that has led to business ethics. But this is no different than all of the other challenges that society is dealing with. There's a roadmap. I guess my point is we need to know what's happening. We need it communicated to us crisply. We need to know what is next. But there's so many roadmaps on other challenges that have been met with in society. This is nothing new. I remember one business guy who had to deal with a major fraud at a major company. There was a quote on the front page of the Wall Street Journal after he fixed all of this. He said, "I'd rather be wrong doing something." Well, let's go do something, but let's say, and here's what we're doing, and we're proud of what we're doing. And so the next time, first we see Pennsylvania, then we see New York, then we saw the release from the Archdiocese of Atlanta, and we're rethrashing the same things from 1950 forward. Well, how many times are we going to have to beat our chests? What are we doing about it? Let's talk about those things. Let's take ownership for it. But these things are nothing different than everything, all the other issues that are going on in society. Now, I say these things from a position of passion, not from anger, but maybe a little bit of anger.
My name's Lucy. Father Desmond, I just sorry. I just really wanted to honor the liminal space that he came from in his comments. And I sort of tied up with that. The one thing I haven't heard from the panel is I feel like we also need to be having a very robust conversation in our church that's linked to the crisis about sexuality and holiness. If each person in the church cannot understand how their journey towards holiness, how their sexuality integrates with that journey, then we can't possibly know how to handle the distortion of sexuality turning up in the priesthood, and then the experience of victims and their own distortion of their sexuality. I say this as a divorced Catholic, whose divorce went through the week that the scandal broke. So I see a lot of parallels in my own journey of my own questions of thinking that I had all of that figured out, and then to see it all fall apart. And so I just honor too that to find yourself in that space of going, I thought I had this down, and now I don't. And I really think that I've had some beautiful conversations with dear friends married, seminarians, about celibacy, about married life, and I think it's all got to be one conversation if we're going to get to the root of it as well. So thank you, Desmond, for being very open.
I want to thank you. I was sharing with Mary during our breakout conversation that the risk of sharing the way I shared is it puts the spotlight on how this individual priest is feeling about certain things. I think there is value in my being transparent. But I don't want the conversation to be about we got to take care of these priests and make them feel better, okay? Because that goes back to clericalism. And that's why it is a very difficult thing to discuss, because I'm going to miss something no matter how I share. So I'm okay. We have to make sure we are taking care of the systemic issues, and I don't want to feed into clericalism, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hello. I've learned a lot today. I did like some of the points about everybody seems to be walking together, as our Canon lawyer expressed, and some of the virtues of responsibility, accountability, transparency, call to holiness. My one comment and then question to any panelist is, I think that clericalism is a problem, but I as a teacher of ethics, I tell my students at Morehouse, I say, you can be poor or rich, black or white, privileged or not, but when it comes down to it, you have to look at yourself in the morning and you have to do the next right thing. And yes, there are systems and structures and problems. There's on a global scale, but according to the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, I'm convinced that Catholic priests who abuse, or anyone who abuses another, is putting themselves above God and the other. And personal responsibility, I think, has to be re-emphasized on the part of priests coming into the seminaries, future priests. Dr. Ardveg has put forth a 4-point plan that involves, he's a scholar on these matters of abuse, that involve careful screening of candidates, psychological, moral, and otherwise, so that that their vows take seriously that challenge I put to my students at Morehouse, to look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, am I doing the right thing? And of course, that will preclude doing the wrong thing, abusing others or putting one's sexual fantasies or power issues above God and the sacred thou, as Martin Luther King described all of us. We're not just consumers and churchgoers, we're sacred vessels. And that call to holiness that I heard at the top of the hour, I think is vital. So, as far as clericalism, I kind of see it as something like this. I wouldn't want to blame the NFL for the system of referees. We still need referees. And by analogy, we still need priests who are called to holiness. I just want to say, if you are a priest or a referee, do your job. Care for those who are in your parish. And for those who are dishonest or aberrant referees or priests, they should be held accountable. And we should pray for them in mercy. So the question out of this is, do any of the panelists see the call to holiness as something involving how we could start with the seminaries and not necessarily blame the referees, but more focus on the system of referees, but rather focus more on those who break the system or break the code, if you will, of conduct of the system?
Thank you. I'd like you to take home two letters, A and A, accountability and accessibility. I have a parallel war story from being hacked 5 times. They want me to send $1,000 to 5 different Bitcoin addresses. I complained to Danny Porter, the Gwinnett County District Attorney, in front of 200 people at a cops' night in Peachtree Corners a couple of months ago. And Danny said he cannot find these addresses in Eastern European and Asia. And I say the simple answer is, if there's no accountability with these people, whether it's the hackers in Eastern Europe or the duplicitous dicastery cardinals that are, quote, celibates, joke, then I think there should be no accessibility. The U.S. should not allow any accessibility to our URL addresses if we cannot catch up with the crooks. And by the same token, the dicasteries have no accountability. We're not hearing anything about what goes on with those people, but they're writing these rules for all the women with this patriarchal, monarchical authority that they can't even do pre-contraception, complete opposite of abortion, because the seed is never nested. There's no comparison, but these duplicitous dicasteries are still setting these rules. They have no accountability. They should not be accessible to us with this kind of rulemaking. Please take home A and A. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve, and I want to thank all the members of the panel for being here, and I appreciated all of the different comments. Each one gave me something to chew on, and I'm grateful for that. I wanted to kind of just take this moment. The question I think that was posed is, what are we feeling right now? And I think the feeling that I have and that I've had for a long time with this ongoing scandal is one of outrage. And today gave me many more things to chew on and think about, but I don't know if it lessened that feeling of outrage, especially when it comes to the issue of accountability. And the gentleman from the Archdiocese that spoke, and I appreciated his points about the role of laity in the leadership of the church. And to some degree it was self-proving by the fact that he is a member of the Archdiocese leadership. And I guess for me, though, the advisory opinion and the advisory role is very, very different from a role of holding authority and being able to hold leaders accountable. And I think, the gentleman that was speaking about the roadmap that exists for solving problems, I'm not sure that the roadmaps that exist for corporate structures or that exist for other entities can be applied to an institution where accountability only seems to go up one level to the next ordained male. And if that's the only way to have accountability in the church, then we've got a structural problem that doesn't analog or correspond to other types of institutional problems. So my feelings of outrage still exist, and I think they are structural, and they are also personal, because I do think there are bad actors who have, as the other gentleman was saying, had this kind of failure to put God or the church in front, but really have put themselves in front. So that's what I'm feeling right now.
Anyone else?
Just really curious as to how the next archbishop is going to be chosen and what is our role in that.
I don't know if you want to comment on anything, but I had a question, maybe for Marie or anyone else. I know lay people had more of a role in bishop selection in history. What has happened to that? And what role do lay people have? I don't know if you can answer anything. Or
I had a conversation with Joel Cossen. He is going to be coming to the Aquinas Center on May 8th to talk to a group. We have had an inter-parish group that's been meeting for the past 6 months. It's growing. We now have 12 parish representatives that have come to that meeting. And Joel is coming on May 8th to talk to that group in the evening. But in the conversation then I said, how do lay people have a voice in how the new archbishop is chosen? So he sent me a link from the U.S. Catholic Conference website, and the only place that there's an implication that lay people can be involved is they expect broad consultation in terms of the needs of the archdiocese or the diocese. They put it in terms of not the arch. Not every diocese is an archdiocese. So any diocese, they expect broad consultation for the needs of the diocese. But there is no direct role for lay people. We are going to have a conversation, however, with Joel Cossen on May 8th to see what kinds of things we can ease in. And as I've said to the group, we don't expect to be successful the first time we try, but we'll only be able to move that conversation along if we start.
It would be so incredibly helpful to those of us who are interested in this to hear from our canon lawyer what the possibilities might look like. And it doesn't have to be tonight, but how it's done and how it has looked in other dioceses would be just a wonderful understanding. And it doesn't even have to be the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My name is Alex. When I'm driving up here, I have an argument with my wife. Alex, there is a crisis. And then I said, perhaps not. I don't think it's a crisis. So I am coming here to listen whether there is a crisis or not. And I think if we say it's a crisis, I have got to know, and please if the panel can tell us the statistics. We need to have statistics so that we can see the proportion of the whole thing, of this particular problem with the whole things. Because I have a very different concern about the church, but it's not this one. Mm-hmm. It's much bigger to me, but I don't want to tell now. But this one, I don't want to undermine that, but we need to have a statistics.
So let me recommend that you go onto the Aquinas Center YouTube channel, and look up the talk that was given by Jerry McGlone, who's a Jesuit priest who came and did that very thing back in February. And he gave a bunch of statistics during his talk. So go to the YouTube channel for Aquinas Center and look up Father Jerry McGlone.
Yeah, so people can hear. Yes, we've, so in partnership with St. Thomas More Aquinas Center, we put together a website, catholiclayresponse.com, where we've collected these various reports, studies, statistics, news, events, and things surrounding the crisis. So that's another source for you.
Hi, my name is Kathy, and I too would like to thank the excellent panel this evening. I guess my feeling right now is that it seems that the onus is on us, the laity. And why is that? Why aren't we hearing more from the hierarchy that has been implicated in some of this cover-up stuff, which seems to be one of the new factors of the Pennsylvania report? It seems like we're the ones that are going through the angst of what do we do, what's next, how can we move forward and see some change or make some change ourselves?
My name is Jane, and I thank everyone and for all their comments. As a layperson who has been awakened, if you will, by this crisis, from a position of feeling disaffected, disenfranchised by the church, institutional. I have, through this process of working through what is the cause of this crisis, how do we address it, I have come to understand that as a layperson, we must take action. There is no way I can stay in this institution if I am not going to be part of the solution, and I'm going to work as hard as I can to find that lay role that is what my baptism gave me, that called me to, that for so many years I've been outside the fence of the power of ministry, and whether it's given to women or not, we can still serve and take on a role more than what we have now. And it's through this that we are going to save the church. It's not that it's only our responsibility, but it is definitely our responsibility shared with others. And I feel so strongly about that, and we've got to find a way to make it happen. And through this crisis, I think we are going to reawaken more vocations. Thank you.
My name is Richard Joseph. I'm a member of St. Thomas More in Decatur. Just a couple of observations. I don't know if any of you were at the Mass of Reparation that Archbishop Gregory had about 2 weeks ago, but I was there. There were probably no more people there than there were here in this room. There were very few people there. It was very poorly attended. Archbishop Gregory seemed to presume that a victim or a survivor would come to that Mass. I seriously doubt there was any survivor at that Mass among the few people who were there. Maybe there was. And I wouldn't expect them to identify themselves, but I doubt it. In a conversation that our parish council had with Archbishop Gregory said that he didn't see any particular need to do anything different because he thought the people accepted what his leadership had produced. Maybe the attendance at the Mass of Reparation was sort of an example of that. Maybe that's true. But I wanted to another observation is, imagine that the church, inhabited by human beings, behaves just like every other secular institution. It aggrandizes power to itself. When it's attacked, it closes the gates, and it only changes when it's forced to change. We should expect that. I hesitate to focus on the word clericalism and prefer to view things from the foundational aspects of the church. We, as the mystical body of Christ, have tended to abdicate our role as the recipients of the deposit of faith. We wait for the church to tell us what we should believe and how we should believe it. Of course, that was one of the aspects of the Reformation. Martin Luther said, people can read Scripture for themselves and figure it out for themselves. We don't have to have somebody tell what Scripture says. Given that background, how the church drums into us that we are, look for the right word, that we are subject to the church's magisterium, and so we have to wait for the church to tell us what and how we should believe. It's no wonder that lay people would willingly abdicate their role as priest, prophet, and king that we acquired in baptism. So I agree with these other speakers. It's time for people to understand what our role is, to inform ourselves about what we believe as the body of Christ, and to take action on that. And I hope with the next bishop that we will be able to propose different ways of doing things, but at least can make a difference in the Archdiocese of Atlanta.
I'm just so edified by so many of the comments that we've heard here tonight, and I just want to make one sort of macro level comment, and that is that a lot of times these conversations can seem very insurgent or subversive, right? Like you're almost like whispering in some ways, like what can we do? What can lay people do? How can we change? But the truth is, to study the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church is to recognize an institution that has changed so dramatically, so many times, again and again and again. Seminaries have not always looked this way. Parishes have not always looked this way. Leadership has not always operated this way. Not that it's been better or worse necessarily in the past, but it's simply to say that all of these sort of micro institutions that make up what we call the Church are historically situated and have evolved time and time again over the past 2 millennia. So in some way, this is the work that we're called to do, right? We're traditioning the church into the present moment, into the future. There's nothing terribly subversive about this work. This is our vocation. What does it mean to be church? What does it mean to do seminary education? What does it mean to do ministry in the 21st century in response to the signs of the times? So I'm so grateful to all of you for contributing your ideas and your burning questions and lived quandaries, because I think that's just so important.
That feels strange to me. I may be the only Protestant here. I'm a student at Candler, and I sort of stumbled in here. Food was the major part. No, I'm really grateful to, first of all, hear the panelists, especially getting the theological and historical background and supplying my knowledge. I want to highlight something we discussed as neighbors, and hopefully this is edifying as well, that especially in the context of Vatican II being within the last century, just a recognition that the wisdom and the power that comes from the different generations, and particularly we're thinking about how young people have such a crucial role in this step, and an encouragement to continue to have these sorts of discussions and inform young generations of what has happened, what continues to happen, and it just needs to be talked about at risk of keeping opening wounds. I understand that there's context for everything, but young people is what's going to be the church forever, and that's always been the story. So just keep connecting generations. Thanks.
You don't have the last word. There's one more.
He actually said a lot of what I was going to say. I just want to say, be fearless in talking to people about this. it makes people uncomfortable. Just like our pastor said at St. Thomas More, he said, the laity must work for change, come from a place of love. Okay, so if you are communicating what we're doing and what we're talking about from a place of love and courage, one person at a time, then that person will talk to 2 more people, and that it's just a web of influence, and that's how change is going to happen.
Thank you all. I've been moved by the love and the passion here. This is church. This is church right here. The love and the care that you do have for this institution, for the people of God. You're welcome to stay here and continue the conversation, but we're going to officially end. Those on the webinar, you can feel free to converse with the groups that you're with. We have an email sign-up list on the way out. If you want to be kept in the loop about these events that are going on and that we're continuing to schedule beginning in the fall, please sign up and be on the Aquinas Center website. And there's also the CatholicLayResponse.com website as well. Okay, thank you.